Physical Gold Fund presents the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards. Insights and analysis about economics, geopolitics, global finance, and gold. Hello, I'm John Ward. On behalf of Physical Gold Fund, we're delighted to welcome you to the latest webinar with Jim Rickards in the series we're calling the Gold Chronicles. Jim Rickards is a New York Times best-selling author and the Chief Global Strategist for West Shore Funds. He's the former General Counsel of Long-Term Capital Management, a consultant to the U.S. intelligence community and to the Department of Defense. He's also an advisory board member of Physical Gold Fund. Hello, Jim, and welcome.
Hi, John. It's great to be with you.
We also have with us Alex Stanzik, Managing Director of Physical Gold Fund. Hello, Alex.
Hello, John. Likewise, great to be here.
Alex will be looking out for questions that come from you, our listeners. So let me just say that your questions for Jim Rickards today are more than welcome. You can post them at any point during the interview. You'll see a box on your screen for typing in your question. And as time allows, we'll do our best to respond to you. So, Jim, your warnings were vindicated. Brexit happened. The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, contrary to the market's expectations and to the betting odds that they seem to be counting on. Well, it was a grand drama, and there were plenty of alarmist prognostications. But of course, the 24-hour news cycle moves on, and we have new events consuming our attention now, some of them quite terrible, and the drama of Brexit seems largely to have slipped from view. So my question to you, has it all been much ado about nothing?
Well, it's a great question, John. It actually has multiple parts, so I'd like to just break them down a little bit and take them one at a time because there is a lot to say on this. Definitely not much ado, but not much ado about nothing. Much ado about quite a few significant things, and let's just kind of take them one at a time. First of all, just to kind of recap a little bit, because the Brexit vote happened and the market reaction happened since we did our last Physical Gold Fund podcast. So I know listeners have had a chance to, learn about this or read about this or absorb it from a lot of different sources, and I assume most of the listeners are familiar with these series of events, but we haven't really had a chance to talk about it on this podcast. So just to recap briefly, June 23rd, there was a referendum in the UK to remain or leave the European Union, the EU. And it was that simple. It was the only question on the ballot. You could vote remain or leave. Each camp, remain and leave, had very well organized campaigns, and the vote was a shock to the markets. Now, just to talk about that a little bit, because I think it's important for the listeners to understand why it was a shock, not just to review the history, but also because going forward, this type of analysis, the analysis that we did to warn people what was going to happen, is the way I do a lot of analysis for gold markets, for capital markets in general. So we were using the same tools prior to Brexit that I use all the time. And so I think it's worth spending a minute on how the market got it wrong. I'll put wrong in quotation marks. Markets are never really right or wrong. They just are what they are. They're information. It's aggregated information. So the trick is not to think about it in terms of being right or wrong, but to think about it in terms of what the market's telling you. And I was out in a number of other channels. Of course, I'm active on Twitter and have publications, but I was out on other channels on June 20th, June 21st, 22nd, the 2 or 3 days running up to Brexit, saying, buy gold, short sterling, this is going to be a shock. We were very well ahead of it. But the reason I said that, the polls were actually too close to call. It wasn't, I did think that they were going to vote to leave, but I wasn't hanging my hat on being able to call the outcome. What I was relying on is the fact that the market had decided that Remain was going to win, and the market priced for Remain. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, in the last couple of weeks prior to the vote, prior to June 23rd, gold dropped about $40 an ounce. It went down from about $1,300 an ounce to $1,260 an ounce. Sterling staged a major rally from about 140 to 150. It was a 7 or 8% rally. So the markets were fully priced for Remain. And I looked at that and I said, gee, that's odd. The polls are telling us this is too close to call, and yet the markets are pricing it at an 80% chance that Remain will win. what's up with that? Why? How do you reconcile those two things? Well, the answer, or at least part of the answer, was that the betting odds were showing 80% remain. So there are a couple of big betting venues in the UK. They love to, a lot of punters there, as they call them, and there are betting parlors on almost every street corner. They're almost like ATMs in the US. I think Ladbrokes is the biggest, but there's some online betting services, Betfair, and some others. And those were showing 75% odds that Remain would win. And the markets were saying, okay, well, we're going to use those odds and say Remain's going to win. We're going to price for Remain. That's why sterling went to 150. That's why gold dropped to 1260. And I said, well, wait a second. What's going on here? The polls are showing it too close to call, but the betting odds are showing it with an 80% chance to Remain, and the markets are acting accordingly. The problem was that, and I say this not disparagingly, but, there's an old saying, John, a little learning is a dangerous thing. And it's true. I like to say, if you're ignorant of something and you're ignorant, that's okay, because you're going to be, you're going to be cautious. You're going to be aware of your own ignorance. If you're expert in something and you use your expertise with the right amount of humility, that's a good thing too. So it's okay to be ignorant if you know you're ignorant. It's okay to be expert if you know you're expert. The danger zone is when you think you know something and you actually don't. And that's what happened in this case. A lot of, I'll say traders probably in their 30s or whatever, had heard about this wisdom of crowds phenomenon, this idea that somehow if you aggregate a bunch of opinion, that result will be better than other sources of information, other expert opinions. And they were looking at the betting odds, applying the wisdom of crowds formula, if you will, and saying, aha, the market's telling us 80% chance of Remain, and they were priced accordingly. That was a complete misapplication of what the wisdom of crowds really teaches and how bookies work. If you know anything about bookies and betting, bookies don't try to make money on the outcome. They just try to make money on the spread. They try to set odds so that they either make money, which is their first choice, or certainly not lose money. And the amount of money being bet was very heavily in favor of Remain. Now, what was interesting was you disaggregated that and said, well, how many people are betting Leave and how many people are betting Remain? The answer there was that it was about 5-1 in favor of Leave. In other words, 5 more bets were being placed on the Leave side than were on the Remain side. But the problem was the money. Leave bets were little bets, £5, £10 or whatever. The Remain bets, you had people betting £1,000. I saw one instance of a woman who bet £100,000 on Remain. So the bookies have to give Remain short odds so they don't get wiped out. So if you know how bookies work and you know how odds are set and you looked at those odds, you wouldn't necessarily say that the wisdom of crowds was saying Remain was going to win. What you would say is that the bookies are giving Remain short odds because they don't want to lose a lot of money. And then the other key point is that the betting pool generally was not a good reflection of the voting pool. There's self-selection going on. First of all, if you're going to go bet, you have to have money to lose. Not everybody has money to lose. Not everybody has £1,000 that they can throw on some bet, no matter how right they think they are. And so, but everybody can vote. Voting is free. The real wisdom of crowds experiments, where the classic experiment was, guess the weight of the cow at a county fair, or guess how many jelly beans in the jelly bean jar, at a county fair. And, the classic experiment was some expert would go up to the jelly bean jar and, get out a ruler and a calculator and calculate the diameter of the jar and the height of the jar and the cubic measure of the jar and the size of an average jelly bean, and take into account the curvature of the jelly bean in the open space, and do all that math and come up with a number. And generally speaking, that number would not be as good, not be as accurate as 1,000 people just saying, I think there's so many jelly beans in the jelly bean jar. That's the wisdom of crowds. And the way it works is that the extreme guesses filter out. So somebody says, I think there's 10 jelly beans in the jelly bean jar. Somebody else says, I think there's 1,000,000 jelly beans. Those two are the outliers. Those kind of cancel each other out on average. And the fact is the average number tends to be highly accurate. But there are a lot of differences between the jelly bean experiment I just described and the betting pool. Number one was the fact that there are no barriers to entry in the jelly bean. You can do it for free. You don't have to pay to do it, whereas in betting you do. And the other thing, and more important, is that the people actually stepping up to bet were, they were city bankers. They were people with a vested interest in the outcome. They were expressing their own biases. So there were a whole bunch of reasons why the betting odds were not a reflection of the actual vote or a reflection of the polls, for that matter. But the market followed it, and that's where the opportunity was, because the minute I saw that the outcome was 50-50, but the odds were 80-20, that's the easiest trade in the world. I love those trades, because if you position for Leave and you're wrong, you're not going to lose much because the market's already priced for Remain. But if you bet Leave and the market's priced for Remain and Remain loses, you're going to make a fortune because the market has to suddenly reprice. It has to swing the other way. So it wasn't so much about putting a stake in the ground on Leave versus Remain as saying you want to do the Leave trade. The Leave trade was short sterling, long gold, because if it is Leave, the market has to reprice and you're going to make a ton of money. But if it's Remain, the market's already priced for Remain, you're not going to lose very much. You had this heads I win, tails you lose situation, which, as I say, are the best kind of trades. The lesson of that is going forward, because, look, we're going to have a national election in the U.S., actually some very big elections coming up in Germany and France next year. And I do see this kind of market participants with a little knowledge of the wisdom of crowds, but not really expert knowledge, using betting results the wrong way, assuming that's the wisdom of crowds when it's really the wisdom of bookies, drawing the wrong conclusions. So I'm going to be looking for this. There'll be other opportunities like this. As I say, a little learning is a dangerous thing. But that's sorry to digress so much, but I think that lesson in statistical science, the wisdom of crowds, and the difference between opinion polls on the one hand and betting odds on the other is quite significant. And you know, when you show up to vote, all votes are equal. When you show up to bet, the guy with the 1,000-pound bet is going to have a lot more weight than the guy with the 5-pound bet. So that's one big difference right there. So that's part of the reason why markets got it wrong. It was a fascinating thing to watch because I was incredulous. I was watching this. I was like, wow. Look at the pound at 150. Look at gold at 1260. Man, if Leave wins, which was a very good bet, these things are going to snap back, and they did. Now, the second part of your question is: has the news cycle moved on? Is it safe to go back in the water? The answer is absolutely not. Now, look, the immediate shock is over. Yeah, the market's repriced. So we had a 14% drop in sterling, and we had let's get the number right, about a 5% rally in gold instantly. I mean, literally within hours of the Pulse closing, 5 p.m. New York time, 10 p.m. London time on June 23rd to June 23rd. Actually, the first poll results tended to favor Remain. Everyone's like, yeah, see, we told you. And then, boom, that Sunderland, I think it was, and some of these other districts started coming in, and it was clear after a few hours that Leave was going to win, and the markets repriced violently. And they did not wait for Friday morning in London. They the markets are 24 hours. Gold is traded 24 hours. Currencies are traded 24 hours. The Tokyo markets were open. The repricing began immediately. So we saw those shocks on Thursday night. But to watch a currency drop, again, 14% in hours, and to watch gold go up, over 5% in hours. These were shocking developments, but they were what we warned investors about, told investors to position for in advance. Okay, so that's over. Now they bounced back a little bit. Gold's off its highs a little bit. Sterling's off its lows. Not to extreme, but to some extent. Things have calmed down. The Conservative Party has made a very smooth leadership transition. You have a new Prime Minister, Theresa May. I wish our presidential transitions were as smooth and well managed as the British, because they did that without too much difficulty in a very short period of time. But all that's happened, John, is that they've now settled on a team. The thing about the Leave group, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and Michael Gove and others, is they were campaigning for Leave, but they didn't have a day two plan. They didn't know what they were going to do if they won. There was no plan as to what to do if Leave won. Well, Leave did win, and then they had to come up with a plan that was clearly being improvised. But now this new leadership, Theresa May is committed to the Brexit. It'll probably take a year and a half to negotiate. But all that's really happened is they have a team. That's good. That's a good place to start. But they don't have a plan. They don't have a strategy. There's going to be some improvisation. Europe itself is divided as to what should happen. Initial indications are that the French want to take a hard line. Sadly, the French have more things on their minds right now than Brexit. Germany wants to be a little less punitive and kind of make this thing work. The U.S. is coaching from the sidelines, although I would say that the U.S. should kind of keep out of it. I think Obama going over there and telling Leave they'd be at the back of the queue if they voted Leave probably did more harm than good in terms of the Remain vote. So for all these reasons, we're just going into a lot of uncertainty. Now, on top of that, it looks like the UK may be headed for a recession. Now, this would have a lot to do with the vote to Leave. I'm not saying the two things are unrelated, but the UK may be in a recession before we ever get around to the serious negotiations on Brexit. Why is that? Well, it's because of uncertainty. It's economists actually have a name for it. It's called regime uncertainty. When you're trying to plan capital expenditures, or you're a global portfolio manager and you're trying to allocate among various currencies and various markets and jurisdictions, there are too many other choices out there. And so this will hurt direct foreign investment going into the UK. It will hurt expansion. It will hurt. There are some winners. The fact that the sterling came down so much, that'll give a little boost to some UK exporters. Someone making some goods to ship to the continent, they'll probably get a few more orders because they look a little bit cheaper at the moment. So there are always some winners to offset the losers. But on the whole, uncertainty tends toward recession because people don't want to spend, corporations don't want to invest, foreign capital does not want to come in. It's not that it's all bad, it's just that there's too much uncertainty and so they shy away. Well, these are the ingredients of recession. The UK probably had a property bubble going on independent of Brexit. 3 major property funds have shut their doors. That doesn't mean they've lost all the money, but they've suspended redemptions if you're an investor in those funds and you thought you could get your money out. Guess again, you've been informed that you can't get your money out until further notice, and that could be years depending on how liquidity goes. Plenty of reason to take the view that the UK is heading into recession. There'll be surprises. Scotland is pushing hard for another referendum on Scottish independence. The last referendum, it was not extremely close, but it was close enough to believe that when you put Brexit on the table, that if the Scots had to do it again, they would vote to leave the UK. So you have the UK leaving the EU, but then you have Scotland potentially leaving the UK. That's disruptive in its own way. Does that mean Scotland joins the euro? Very likely, in my view, because what are you going to have, a Scottish pound? I mean, you could leave aside the fact that what little gold, I'll say, England has remaining is probably going to stay in England. I doubt they're going to ship Scotland's share of the gold, whatever that might be, to Edinburgh or Glasgow. And then Northern Ireland's in play once again. It's been in play for 100 years. So, no, I don't think it's safe to go in the water. I think that you've got some panels that are pointing in the direction of recession. I think the pound is a lot further to fall. I understand it's bounced back a little bit. It got to a low of around $1.25. It's kind of struggled its way back to about $1.33. That's fine, but they still, again, with the uncertainty, the lack of gold, the economic recession, at least some in Europe, the Poles, French, among others, looking to be punitive. Good reason to think that sterling will go a lot lower from here. So, the shock effect is over. The market repricing is over. The leadership vacuum is over. But all that does is set up a blank sheet of paper to start the negotiation, and that's going to go on for a year and a half with a lot of uncertainty. So I think it's still a problem for global markets. Global markets have enough problems already with the slowdown in China, slowdown in the United States, what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in Russia, sanctions, not to mention, sadly, the war on terror and terrorist attacks. So the world has enough problems, put it that way, without one more, but we do have one more.
Well, thanks, Jim. Let me turn to a slightly different topic, although there's kind of subtle overlap. In the last issue of your own newsletter, Strategic Intelligence, you wrote at length about what you call the global monetary elites. And at first sight, it might seem a rather vague concept, but in that article, you actually give it a very precise definition. So could you take a moment and tell us, what does this phrase, the global monetary elites, mean to you? And what should it mean to us?
Well, another great question, John. I'm happy to expand on that. First of all, I've been using the phrase elites for global monetary elites, international financial elites, variations with usually the word elite in there somewhere for years, going back to my first book, Currency Wars, which came out in 2011 and even earlier. And I remember at the time I first started using it, I got a lot of pushback from, readers, friends, colleagues, editors saying, Jim, you're throwing this word elite around. It sounds a little mysterious. It sounds like a tinfoil hat conspiracy, something like a scene out of Spectre, the James Bond movie. Are you sure that's a good way to describe it? I felt strongly that it was, and I still do. What's interesting is how frequently I'm seeing the word elite from the elites. You read it in whether it's Larry Summers or Anatole Kaletsky or Adair Turner or other commentators, and the last two names, I assume most people know who Larry Summers are, but Adair Turner and Anatole Kaletsky are the chairman and director of a think tank called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, financed by George Soros, which is one of the leading venues, if you will, for financial ideas in terms of the New World Order. These people are using the phrase elites. Gillian Tett, Martin Wolf at the Financial Times, and others. Of course, everyone I just mentioned is part of the elite, but they're talking about elite failure, starting with Brexit, which was a little bit of a English-driven, popular revolt. And I say, John, you know England far better than I do, but when I say England, I use that very advisedly. England, Americans tend to take England, Britain, UK, and mush it all together, and of course that's not true. England is a part of the UK, a part of Britain with deep historical roots and the tradition of English independence, and then Scotland is Scotland, and Wales and Northern Ireland. Those are all different parts of the UK. But we may be getting back to England, as I say, if Scotland goes its own way, if Northern Ireland sees some opportunity for reconciliation with the Republic of Ireland. I'm not so sure about Wales, but we may be getting back to some concept of England. But my point being, if you look at the vote, the way the Brexit vote skewed, Scotland was heavily in favor of Remain. Northern Ireland, heavily in favor of Remain. City of London, heavily in favor of Remain. Where did the Leave vote come from? Well, it came from smaller cities, Humberside, Leeds, the countryside, the far west of England, Cornwall, and elsewhere. It was really an English vote as much against their partners in the UK as their partners in the EU. This was considered an elite failure. Why did the elites not see it coming? Why did the elites not do a better job of appealing to the everyday English subject, etc.? Now, of course, you hear it with regard to Donald Trump. The Trump phenomenon is amazing. I'm not going to get into the politics or pick sides. That's not what I do. That's for other plenty of radio shows and podcasts that will cover that ground. But I would point out that elites in the United States, you go back a little over a year to say early June 2015. First, they said that Trump wouldn't run. Then he announced he was running, and they said, well, he's a joke. Then he turned out to have a serious campaign, and they said, well, he can't win primaries. Then he started winning primaries, and they said, well, he's capped at 30%. Then he blew past 50%, and they said, well, he won't get the nomination on the first ballot. Now he's locked in the nomination on the first ballot, and they say he can't beat Hillary. Well, where I come from, if you're wrong 5 times in a row, I'm not supposed to listen to you the 6th time. In other words, the elites have been wrong every single time, whether he would run, whether he could win, whether he could get the nomination, et cetera. And I think that they may well be wrong about whether he can beat Hillary. That remains to be seen. But my point being, the Remain elites were wrong in the UK. The US elites were wrong about Trump. There's a lot of soul-searching among the elites as to how out of touch they are, and they are out of touch. The problem, John, with being in a bubble is you don't know you're in the bubble. So let me just step back a second and talk about who the elites are. I'll come back to the subject because it's an important one. The elites this is not some vague, amorphous, hooded conspiracy meeting around a boardroom in a dimly lit milieu. We know who they are. It's by name. It's Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF. It's Larry Summers at Harvard. It's Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank. It's Janet Yellen, Stan Fisher, Bill Dudley at the Federal Reserve Bank. It's think tankers. It's people like Anatol Kleski and Adair Turner I mentioned. So it's a combination of policymakers, government officials, think tank experts, professors, and some journalists. I'll throw the journalists in for good measure. And we know them all by name. So first of all, it's not a mystery. We know who they are. Their biggest problem is they hang out with each other. Christine Lagarde's not on this call listening to you and me. She's probably talking to Larry Summers, right? So the point being, if you don't get it, if you're out of touch, and the only people you talk to are other people who don't get it and are out of touch, then you're never going to get it. And this is what I mean when I say when you're in the bubble and you hang out in Georgetown or this time of year in Nantucket or the Hamptons, or in the winter you go to Davos, in August you go to Jackson Hole, and all these in the spring you go to the Milken Institute, all these elite venues. When that's your world, and you're in the world of private jets and private dinners, and only talking to your own ilk, then you actually are out of touch. You actually don't understand. One of my favorite lines is an old song by Bob Dylan called "Ballad of a Thin Man," and the refrain is, there's something happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? And our listeners should be grateful I didn't try to sing it because I can't sing, but I can recite the line. But the point being, there's something happening in the world, and the elites don't know what it is. But they're finding out the hard way. They're starting to go up the learning curve because you start losing some big events like Brexit and possibly the election of Trump. You're going to have to learn fast. So that's who the elite is. They do run the system. Now, I like to say that they are transparently non-transparent. And what I mean by that is, again, they do not operate in secret. Yeah, sure, there are secret meetings and secret dinners on the sidelines of G20 and IMF meetings. I understand that. But they actually are big mouths. I mean, they publish papers, they give speeches, they do interviews, they have websites. They're actually putting out a lot of material. That's the transparency side. The non-transparency side is nobody understands it. They have a very specific jargon. You have to be kind of a trained expert to know what all these terms mean. I'm not saying they're incomprehensible. I'm saying you actually have to be an expert to know what they're talking about. And they're not that widely read, compared to in this podcast, for example, or some of the things we do. Not that many people go to Larry Summers' website. I do because I'm a geek. I'm not an elite, but I am a geek, and I'll go read what Larry Summers has to say. But most people have better things to do on a Friday afternoon in the summer. My point is what they're really doing is they're writing for each other. Larry Summers is writing in the Financial Times so that George Soros can read it. Or Anatol Koletsky is writing on Project Syndicate so that Christine Lagarde can read him. They're talking to each other. And what they're saying is fascinating because they're saying that the system is close to collapse. When you actually read papers from people like Claudio Barrio at the Bank for International Settlement, he's the chief monetary economist at the Central Bank for Central Banks. I mean, how geeky is that? But he's a really thoughtful guy and a good writer, and read his stuff. He's saying that the debt situation is non-sustainable. It's getting worse by the day. You can't tax people anymore. We can't get growth. We're stuck in stagnation. Debt to GDP ratios are going up. We're going to have waves of defaults coming from emerging markets, China, the energy sector, et cetera. And again, Christine Lagarde, she won't go on television and say, hey, people, run for the hills. This is all going to collapse. But if you read between the lines and you understand the jargon, that is kind of what she's saying. And sometimes I feel, I've said this before, sometimes I feel like an anthropologist going into the Amazon jungle, speaking the native languages, and then coming back and reporting to what they're actually saying. I mean, part of what I do, because I went to the graduate schools in economics where people are trained for the IMF, and most of my career was spent in banking, including more meetings at the Fed than I care to remember, and I've studied quite a bit. And so my training, my background, my experience give me the facility to understand all this, and I guess I've got the stamina to actually read it all, although some of it's painful. And then all I do really is put it in plain English. So when I give warnings, it's not me making things up. It's not me trying to frighten people. What I tell people, some people accuse me and say, hey, Jim, you're scaring people. Like, I'm not scaring anybody. They're already scared. What I'm trying to do is shed a little light on the situation. Maybe put people's minds at ease in the sense that, there may be some frightening things out there, but if you can understand it, it's a little less frightening. And then most importantly, there are steps you can take, including buying physical gold, to preserve your wealth when this all comes tumbling down. So just to wrap up, John, there is an elite, but they're not mysterious. We know who they are. They're actually out there yakking away or writing away, but it's a little bit in code, so you got to get your translator decoder ring out there to understand what they're saying. A lot of their dialogue is not for the benefit of everyday citizens. They're actually talking to each other, bouncing policy ideas around. That's how you can predict policy, by the way. When you see 7 or 8 elites in 7 or 8 different publications all saying the same thing, you know that they've been passing the Kool-Aid. You know that they're, in the hallways and the closed dining rooms where it is hard to get into, that they've, among themselves, they said, you know what, monetary policy is not working, quantitative easing is not working, negative interest rates are not working. What we need is debt monetization. What we need is structural change, fiscal stimulus, helicopter money. When you see it coming from 7 or 8 different sources, you know it's coming, and that makes it easy to predict policy. So just to wrap up, I would say there is an elite. We know who they are. With the right training, you can follow what they're saying. They are issuing warnings. There are things people can do. We're not helpless.
That's really illuminating. Thank you. And just briefly, before we move on, it's what you said about England, of course, intrigued me because I'm an Englishman, And actually, it's only in the United States I've had to learn to call myself a Brit, not a term I would ever have used at home.
Exactly.
Okay, so talking of which, actually, included in your definition of the global monetary elites is the governor of the Bank of England. And I wondered if we could turn our attention to that institution just for a moment. I must say I have a sentimental interest because I went to school in walking distance at Threadneedle Street. But two more serious reasons. First, historically, it would seem that the Bank of England helped give shape to the modern central bank. And then looking forward, Mark Carney, the bank's current governor, will have his hands full managing the fallout from Brexit with all the global repercussions that you've mentioned. So I wonder if you could just take a moment now to share your thoughts about the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street.
I'd be happy to. And for listeners who are not familiar, the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street is the nickname for the Bank of England because it's located on Threadneedle Street in the city of London. Yeah, what I do, John, I distinguish between the Bank of England as an historical institution, really the first central bank formed in exactly the way it was formed. Fabulous history, fabulous monetary history, great institutional memory, great traditions, and all of that, from what we have today, which is really just a pale shadow of what the Bank of England used to be. So there is this dichotomy between old and new, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But let's start with our friend Mark Carney. Mark Carney is the governor of the Bank of England, so he is in effect the equivalent of Janet Yellen, who's of course the chairwoman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. He doesn't have the sole word. There is something called the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. It has people go on and off it. Howard Davies was on it at one time. Danny Blanchflower, a professor up at Dartmouth these days, was on it. So, people kind of come and go from the Monetary Policy Committee. In effect, the equivalent of our Federal Open Market Committee, which, on a collegial basis get together and set rates. But no doubt that Mark Carney is by far first among equals. And again, as I say, performs a role similar to Janet Yellen. What people may not know is before he was governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada, the Central Bank of Canada. I think there ought to be term limits on maybe geographic limits. I don't think he should be the head of two central banks. That seems a little bit over the top, but he was. I don't know of anyone else who was the head of central banks in two different countries. Actually, Sam Fisher comes close. Sam Fisher was the head of the Bank of Israel, and today is the vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So he was number one in Israel, number two at the Fed, but Mark Carney was number one in Canada, number one in the UK. So he's, I think he takes the prize. He's sort of a super elite, meaning not only was he the head of two different, G7 central banks, but he's also I believe he's the chairman, or if not, certainly a board member of the Bank for International Settlements. I think he is the chairman, actually, the Bank for International Settlements, which is nicknamed the Central Bankers Central Bank. Bank for International Settlements, based in Basel, Switzerland, BIS for short. I call this a treehouse for central banking boys and girls. They meet there once a month. They have a lunch overlooking the river that runs nearby. No minutes, no notes, no press releases, no statements, no press conferences, nothing. They just close the doors and talk among themselves. This is really where the central bankers rigged the system, and it's completely beyond the scope of any jurisdiction. It's legally formed in Switzerland, but when the charter was set up, the Swiss law agreed that they wouldn't exert jurisdiction over the BIS, so it's almost as if it might as well be in outer space or planet Mars or something in terms of legal jurisdiction. It's almost like no country in the world, including the country where it is located, can tell them what to do. So it's about as secretive, autonomous, non-responsible as you can imagine. And one of the things they do, by the way, they are the secret broker for gold between countries and banks. So if the Federal Reserve wants to lease gold to JP Morgan for the account of the IMF, that transaction would run through the BIS so that we would never see it. You can look at the footnotes of the BIS financial statements and find evidence that they do this activity, but you won't find the specific names or the specific transactions. They just disclose you that this is what they do. But it's where the gold market is manipulated, the physical gold market is manipulated. The paper gold market, just go to the COMEX. But physical gold is manipulated. Gold is moved around among central banks at BIS. Global policies are coordinated at BIS. So it's a super secret institution. So Mark Carney is chairman of the board at the BIS, governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada. So as I say, a kind of super elite. Now, he's had an interesting role. By the way, the Bank of England, until 1971, well, actually technically 1973, when the IMF demonetized gold, did operate a gold standard. There was discretionary monetary policy side by side with the gold standard. There were numerous devaluations of sterling, so I'm not saying it was a flawless performance by any means, but technically they were on a gold standard. But prior to 1914, it was a very rigorous gold standard. So we're talking about a period, I don't have the exact date in front of me, but 17th century. So let's say early 17th century until 1914, a period of almost 300 years, the Bank of England ran a gold standard with about 20% gold. Actually, not that much. It was enough to stand up to the market, but nowhere near 100% of the currency issue. And yet, the pound sterling, the Bank of England note, was considered as good as gold. They also had a gold coin issued by the Royal Mint called the Sovereign. The Sovereign is a 1 ounce gold coin. It was not 24 karat, which is not practical. It was 22 karat, exactly like the American Gold Eagle, which means it had a little bit of alloy, but the alloy was there. You still had your ounce of gold. The alloy was there to give it some durability, so as it was getting passed around, it wouldn't wear out because, of course, gold is soft. If you have a 24 karat coin, it wears out, which you don't want. But I'll say, pick a date, 1898, an Englishman boarding a steamship in Southampton, heading for Bombay at the time, today Mumbai, in India, part of the British Empire at the time, would have taken a certain number of Bank of England notes and a certain amount of physical gold sovereigns with him or her, and on arrival, that would have been money good. That was world money. That was world money. You could go anywhere in the world. It didn't have to be a British colony. Well, it could be anywhere. It could be China. It could be Russia. It could be South America, or the British Empire at the time, later the Commonwealth, Australia. That money that you put in your pocket in London was money good anywhere in the world. It was the last time the world really saw a global monetary standard, at least one that was stable, and they had price stability through that whole time. Now, there were a couple of suspensions, which one would expect during the Napoleonic Wars. Nothing wrong with suspending convertibility during wartime. The war is existential. You have to do whatever is necessary. But to their credit, the Bank of England went back to the gold standard not long after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. So, and then again maintained it under the classic gold standard all the way up to 1914. So you had this, and they understood banking. I mean, what amazes me today, John, is how central bankers don't understand banking. And when I say that, I'm not being facetious and I'm not being derogatory. They're PhDs. They went to MIT and Harvard. They understand financial economics, or they think they do. They understand some version of financial economics that bears very little relationship to the real world. That's what they know. That's what they got their PhDs in. They're not actually bankers. I wish we had more bankers in the central bank, but we don't. We've got academics. But in the day, the bankers understood, and I was fortunate. I started my career in banking in the 70s when, the idea of banking was still meant something, but it was all based on confidence. Every banker knew that there were never enough liquid assets to pay the depositors. There was never enough gold to cash in every note, that what you had were some liquid assets and some gold so you could meet some demand, but you knew that there was never enough if it got out of control. And so what you did is you did everything possible to maintain confidence, integrity, and that's all gone by the board. Today, bankers are, I call JP Morgan the world's largest criminal enterprise. Bankers have squandered their integrity. They're an extended exercise in greed. They put themselves first instead of the customers. In my day, the customer always came first. You figured you put the customer first and you could make money. But today it's like, oh no, how do I make money, and the heck with the customer. So unfortunately all this has been turned upside down. But that's the sort of a classic banking function. But my point being, it was all based on confidence. Today, bankers don't worry about confidence because they know the central banks will bail them out. They know that if they get in trouble, which they do like clockwork because banks always screw up, that the central bank will be there with tens of trillions of dollars of new liquidity, easy money, zero interest rates, negative interest rates, currency swaps, guarantees, whatever it takes, in other words. So all of that has gone by the board. So I would say that I have enormous respect for the economic and financial and banking history of the Bank of England. I think anyone who studies that history, I particularly recommend a book called Lombard Street by Walter Bagehot. Walter Bagehot, interestingly, was a journalist. He was not a trained academic, but he was one of these people who understood banking. And he wrote a book called Lombard Street about the UK money markets. All the things we're talking about, John, on this podcast: gold standard, lender of last resort. How do you maintain confidence? How do you maintain integrity? The importance of character. These are all covered in that book. It's a short book, not too difficult to read. But if you want to know what banking used to be like, and maybe again, actually, hopefully, that's a good book to read. But unfortunately, all that's gone by the board. What we have are people like Mark Carney, and Janet Yellen, Stan Fisher. They're not bad people. They're not dumb people. They're a lot smarter than I am, but they kind of know the wrong things. They know a version of financial economics, as I say, that does not correspond well with the real world.
Thanks very much, Jim. That's a great tour of that significant piece of history and its implications for the present. So now over to you, Alex. What questions do you have today from our listeners?
Thank you very much, John. And Jim, back to the point you were just making, fascinating points about the Bank of England. Big fan of history myself. And there's one thing that you mentioned is, Ed, during this time they were on a gold standard for 300 years. You had mentioned that it was world money. I would contend that, based upon a little anecdotal point, it's still world money. Unless the U.S. Air Force changed its procedures since the last time I checked. To my knowledge, they put an ounce of gold in the survival kit of Air Force pilots when they are deployed overseas. And my guess is that they can use this as money if they go down or if they crash. That's accepted no matter where they are worldwide.
I think that's right, Alex. There are a few global phenomena. One of them, I think the word beer is the same in every language. Except Spanish is cerveza, but everywhere else you go, even in Japan, it's biru, with some version of beer. So that's universal. And the other universal, in addition to beer, is gold. So I agree with that completely.
Okay, very good. So the first question is coming in from Joel H. It's in regards to the Shanghai Accord. Joel, by the way, is something of a celebrity. So Joel, hi. Glad to have you on the webinar today. He's got almost 250,000 followers on Twitter. His question is, does the threat of perpetual bonds in Japan disrupt the Shanghai Accord?
Well, first of all, that's on the table. There's some reporting just really in the last couple of days that when Ben Bernanke was there. Ben Bernanke was in Japan earlier this week, meeting with Abe and recommending helicopter money. No surprise from helicopter Ben. But it was reported that when he was there on an earlier visit in April, he had spoken to the Japanese about perpetual bonds. And this is a variation on modern monetary theory, debt monetization, a version of helicopter money. It goes by a lot of different names, but the scenario is something like this. What's wrong with spending money? Why don't we just have bigger deficits, and then we run these bigger deficits, we spend the money on whatever, infrastructure, build some new highways, airports, and we need all that. I'm not saying that infrastructure isn't a need. Of course it is. But the U.S. has 100% debt to GDP ratio. Japan has a 250% debt to GDP ratio. Greece is somewhere between the U.S. and Japan, but Japan takes the cake. And so the question is, okay, maybe some infrastructure spending is fine. Maybe at these low interest rates, it's not even a bad idea. But what is the outer limit on debt? How much debt can a country issue before investors lose confidence in the currency and in the debt itself and just start dumping it? And then, of course, in that scenario, the currency collapses and interest rates go to the moon. And, it's an interesting question. I am certain that there is a limit. I'm equally certain that I don't know what it is. I can't pinpoint it. But what I look at is the dynamic. I look for clues that we're getting closer. I look for evidence that the collapse is coming. And those are what in intelligence work we call indications and warnings. And you kind of look for it to try to figure these things out, even though you don't know, as I said, the exact hour and the exact day. Modern monetary theory, and actually what Bernanke is saying, and Adair Turner and others is saying is, no, it's all good. That you don't have to worry about the confidence boundary. As long as the central bank can print the money and buy the debt, it's all good. So governments should just spend as much as they want, hopefully put it to good use, although I don't really count on governments to do that, but that's the theory anyway. Once again, the theory and the reality tend to be two different things. And so you have these deficits. You say, well, gee, how do I cover the deficit? Well, the answer is issue bonds. Have your Minister of Finance or your Treasury Department or your fiscal authority issue bonds. And then you say, well, what if nobody wants the bonds? So no problem. Just have the central bank buy them. And then the last part of that puzzle is to say, well, gee, okay, but, it's a 5-year note or a 2-year note, and, in 2 years we're going to have to refinance it because that's going to mature, and you're going to have to give the central bank their money back, and we're going to have to refinance that 2-year note. And what if conditions are rocky 2 years from now when I have to roll over my 2-year note, or 5 years from now when I have to roll over my 5-year note? What am I going to do then if interest rates are too high? Hey, no problem. Make it perpetual. Never pay it back. That's the theory. That's what Bernanke was talking about. So in theory, Japan would get its economy moving by spending money on infrastructure. They would cover the deficit by issuing bonds. The bonds would be perpetual. The Bank of Japan would print the money, buy the bonds, and hold them on their balance sheet forever. And then people look at me, the modern monetary theorists look at me and say, what's wrong with that, Jim? Tell me what's wrong with that. And, it's a tough question. I can tell you what's wrong with it, which is that you're ignoring behavior, you're ignoring history, you're ignoring psychology. Just to put it in more scientific space, you're ignoring, critical thresholds, recursive functions.
So it seems we've lost touch with Jim here. Let me just check with Alex. Alex, can you hear Jim?
Nope, I think we have lost him. So that does happen from time to time on webinars like this.
Well, listeners, I regret we must call it a day here, with apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. We'll be sure to make extra time in our next podcast. So, meanwhile, thank you, Alex and Jim. Hoping you can still hear us, our thanks to you. It's always a pleasure and an education having you with us. And most of all, thank you to our listeners for spending time with us today. Let me encourage you to follow Jim on Twitter. His handle is @JamesG.Rickards. So goodbye for now, and we look forward to joining you again soon. You have been listening to The Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards, presented by Physical Gold Fund. Recordings can be found at physicalgoldfund.com/podcasts. You can register there for news of upcoming interviews with Jim Rickards and other world-class thinkers.
Put wrong in quotation marks. Markets are never really right or wrong. They just are what they are. They're information. It's aggregated information. So the trick is not to think about it in terms of being right or wrong, but to think about it in terms of what the market's telling you. And I was out in a number of other channels. Of course, I'm active on Twitter and have publications, but I was out on other channels on June 20th, June 21st, 22nd, the 2 or 3 days running up to Brexit, saying, buy gold, short sterling, this is going to be a shock. We were very well ahead of it. But the reason I said that, the polls were actually too close to call. It wasn't, I did think that they were going to vote to leave, but I wasn't hanging my hat on being able to call the outcome. What I was relying on is the fact that the market had decided that Remain was going to win, and the market priced for Remain. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, in the last couple of weeks prior to the vote, prior to June 23rd, gold dropped about $40 an ounce. It went down from about $1,300 an ounce to $1,260 an ounce. Sterling staged a major rally from about 140 to 150. It was a 7 or 8% rally. So the markets were fully priced for Remain. And I looked at that and I said, gee, that's odd. The polls are telling us this is too close to call, and yet the markets are pricing it at an 80% chance that Remain will win. What's up with that? How do you reconcile those two things? Well, the answer, or at least part of the answer, was that the betting odds were showing 80% Remain. So there are a couple of big betting venues in the UK. They got a lot of punters there, as they call them, and there are betting parlors on almost every street corner. They're almost like ATMs in the US. I think Ladbrokes is the biggest, but there's some online betting services, Betfair, and some others. And those were showing 75% odds that Remain would win. And the markets were saying, okay, well, we're going to use those odds and say Remain's going to win. We're going to price for Remain. That's why sterling went to 150. That's why gold dropped to 1260. And I said, well, wait a second. What's going on here? The polls are showing it too close to call, but the betting odds are showing it with an 80% chance of Remain, and the markets are acting accordingly. The problem was that, and I say this not disparagingly, but there's an old saying, John, a little learning is a dangerous thing. And it's true. I like to say, if you're ignorant of something and you're ignorant, that's okay, because you're going to be, you're going to be cautious. You're going to be aware of your own ignorance. If you're expert in something and you use your expertise with the right amount of humility, that's a good thing too. So it's okay to be ignorant if you know you're ignorant. It's okay to be expert if you know you're expert. The danger zone is when you think you know something and you actually don't. And that's what happened in this case. A lot of, I'll say traders probably in their 30s or whatever, had heard about this wisdom of crowds phenomenon, this idea that somehow if you aggregate a bunch of opinion, that result will be better than other sources of information, other expert opinions. And they were looking at the betting odds, applying the wisdom of crowds formula, if you will, and saying, aha, the market's telling us 80% chance of remain, and they were pricing accordingly. That was a complete misapplication of what the wisdom of crowds really teaches and how bookies work. If you know anything about bookies and betting, bookies don't try to make money on the outcome. They just try to make money on the spread. They try to set odds so that they either make money, which is their first choice, or certainly not lose money. A team, that's good. That's a good place to start, but they don't have a plan. They don't have a strategy. There's going to be some improvisation. Europe itself is divided as to what should happen. Initial indications are that the French want to take a hard line. Sadly, the French have more things on their minds right now than Brexit. Germany wants to be a little less punitive and kind of make this thing work. The U.S. is coaching from the sidelines, although I would say that the U.S. should kind of keep out of it. I think Obama going over there and telling Leave they'd be at the back of the queue if they voted Leave probably did more harm than good in terms of the Remain vote. So for all these reasons, we're just going into a lot of uncertainty. Now, on top of that, it looks like the UK may be headed for a recession. Now, this would have a lot to do with the vote to leave. I'm not saying the two things are unrelated, but the UK may be in a recession before we ever get around to the serious negotiations on Brexit. Why is that? Well, it's because of uncertainty. Economists actually have a name for it. It's called regime uncertainty. When you're trying to plan capital expenditures, or you're a global portfolio manager and you're trying to allocate among various currencies and various markets and jurisdictions, there are too many other choices out there. And so this will hurt direct foreign investment going into the UK. It will hurt expansion. It will hurt. There are some winners. The fact that the sterling came down so much, that'll give a little boost to some UK exporters. Someone making some goods to ship to the continent, they'll probably get a few more orders because they look a little bit cheaper at the moment. So there are some winners to offset the losers. But on the whole, uncertainty tends toward recession because people don't want to spend, corporations don't want to invest, foreign capital does not want to come in. It's not that it's all bad. It's just that there's too much uncertainty, and so they shy away. Well, these are the ingredients of recession. The UK probably had a property bubble going on independent of Brexit. 3 major property funds have shut their doors. That doesn't mean they've lost all the money, but they've suspended redemptions if you're an investor in those funds and you thought you could get your money out. Guess again, you've been informed that you can't get your money out until further notice, and that could be years depending on how liquidity goes. Plenty of reason to take the view that the UK is heading into recession. There'll be surprises. Scotland is pushing hard for another referendum on Scottish independence. The last referendum, it was not extremely close, but it was close enough to believe that when you put Brexit on the table, that if the Scots had to do it again, they would vote to leave the UK. So you have the UK leaving the EU, but then you have Scotland potentially leaving the UK. That's disruptive in its own way. Does that mean Scotland joins the euro? Very likely, in my view, because what are you going to have, a Scottish pound? I mean, you could leave aside the fact that what little gold, I'll say, England has remaining is probably going to stay in England. I doubt they're going to ship Scotland's share of the gold, whatever that might be, to Edinburgh or Glasgow. And then Northern Ireland's in play once again. It's been in play for 100 years. So, no, I don't think it's safe to go in the water. I think that you've got some panels that are pointing in the direction of recession. I think the pound is a lot further to fall. I understand it's bounced back a little bit. It got to a low of around $1.25. It's kind of struggled its way back to about $1.33. That's fine, but they still, again, with the uncertainty, the lack of gold, the economic recession, at least some lose situation, which, as I say, are the best kind of trades. The lesson of that is going forward, because look, we're going to have a national election in the U.S., actually some very big elections coming up in Germany and France next year. And I do see this kind of market participants with a little knowledge of the wisdom of crowds, but not really expert knowledge, using betting results the wrong way, assuming that's the wisdom of crowds when it's really the wisdom of bookies, drawing the wrong conclusions. So I'm going to be looking for this. There'll be other opportunities like this. As I say, a little learning is a dangerous thing. But that's sorry to digress so much, but I think that lesson in statistical science, the wisdom of crowds, and the difference between opinion polls on the one hand and betting odds on the other is quite significant. And when you show up to vote, all votes are equal. When you show up to bet, the guy with the 1,000-pound bet is going to have a lot more weight than the guy with the 5-pound bet. So that's one big difference right there. So that's part of the reason why markets got it wrong. It was a fascinating thing to watch because I was incredulous. I was watching this. I was like, wow, look at the pound at 150. Look at gold at 1260. Man, if Lee wins, which was a very good bet, these things are going to snap back, and they did. Now the second part of your question is has the news cycle moved on? Is it safe to go back in the water? The answer is absolutely not. Now look, the immediate shock is over. Yeah, the market's repriced. So we had a 14% drop in sterling, and we had let's get the number right, about a 5% rally in gold instantly. I mean, literally within hours of the Pulse closing, 5 p.m. New York time, 10 p.m. London time on June 23rd to June 23rd. Actually, the first poll results tended to favor Remain. Everyone's like, yeah, see, we told you. And then boom, that Sunderland, I think it was, and some of these other districts started coming in, and it was clear after a few hours that Lee was going to win, and the markets repriced violently. And they did not wait for Friday morning in London. They the markets are 24 hours. Gold is traded 24 hours. Currencies are traded 24 hours. The Tokyo markets were open. The repricing began immediately. So we saw those shocks on Thursday night. But to watch a currency drop, again, 14% in hours, and to watch gold go up, over 5% in hours. These were shocking developments, but they were what we warned investors about, told investors to position for in advance. Okay, so that's over. Now they bounced back a little bit. Gold's off its highs a little bit. Sterling's off its lows. Not to extreme, but to some extent. Things have calmed down. The Conservative Party has made a very smooth leadership transition. You have a new Prime Minister, Theresa May. I wish our presidential transitions were as smooth and well managed as the British, because they did that without too much difficulty in a very short period of time. But all that's happened, John, is that they've now settled on a team. The thing about the Leave group, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and Michael Gove and others, is they were campaigning for Leave, but they didn't have a day two plan. They didn't know what they were going to do if they won. There was no plan as to what to do if Leave won. Well, Leave did win, and then they had to come up with a plan that was clearly being improvised. But now this new leadership, Theresa May is committed to the Brexit. It'll probably take a year and a half to negotiate. But all that's really happened is they have...
Physical Gold Fund presents the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards. Insights and analysis about economics, geopolitics, global finance, and gold. Hello, I'm John Ward. On behalf of Physical Gold Fund, we're delighted to welcome you to the latest webinar with Jim Rickards in the series we're calling the Gold Chronicles. Jim Rickards is a New York Times best-selling author and the Chief Global Strategist for West Shore Funds. He's the former General Counsel of Long-Term Capital Management, a consultant to the U.S. intelligence community and to the Department of Defense. He's also an advisory board member of Physical Gold Fund. Hello, Jim, and welcome.
Hi, John. It's great to be with you.
We also have with us Alex Stanzik, Managing Director of Physical Gold Fund. Hello, Alex.
Hello, John. Likewise, great to be here.
Alex will be looking out for questions that come from you, our listeners. So let me just say that your questions for Jim Rickards today are more than welcome. You can post them at any point during the interview. You'll see a box on your screen for typing in your question. And as time allows, we'll do our best to respond to you. So, Jim, your warnings were vindicated. Brexit happened. The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, contrary to the market's expectations and to the betting odds that they seem to be counting on. Well, it was a grand drama, and there were plenty of alarmist prognostications, But of course, the 24-hour news cycle moves on, and we have new events consuming our attention now, some of them quite terrible, and the drama of Brexit seems largely to have slipped from view. So my question to you, has it all been much ado about nothing?
Well, it's a great question, John. It actually has multiple parts, so I'd like to just break them down a little bit and take them one at a time because there is a lot to say on this. Definitely not, much ado, but not much ado about nothing. Much ado about quite a few significant things, and let's just kind of take them one at a time. First of all, just to kind of recap a little bit, because the Brexit vote happened and the market reaction happened since we did our last Physical Gold Fund podcast, so I know listeners have had a chance to, learn about this or read about this or absorb it from a lot of different sources, and I assume most of the listeners are familiar with these series of events, but we haven't really had a chance to talk about it on this podcast. So just to recap briefly, June 23rd, there was a referendum in the UK to remain or leave the European Union, the EU. And it was that simple. It was the only question on the ballot. You could vote remain or leave. Each camp, remain and leave, had very well organized campaigns, and the vote was a shock to the markets. Now, just to talk about that a little bit, because I think it's important for the listeners to understand why it was a shock, not just to review the history, but also because going forward, this type of analysis, the analysis that we did to warn people what was going to happen, is the way I do a lot of analysis for gold markets, for capital markets in general. So we were using the same tools prior to Brexit that I use all the time. And so I think it's worth spending a minute on how the market got it wrong. And the amount of money being bet was very heavily in favor of remain. Now, what was interesting was you disaggregated that and said, well, how many people are betting leave and how many people are betting remain? The answer there was that it was about 5-1 in favor of leave. In other words, 5 more bets were being placed on the leave side than were on the remain side. But the problem was the money. Leave bets were little bets, £5, 10 quid, or whatever. The remain bets, you had people betting £1,000. I saw one instance of a woman who bet £100,000 on remain. So the bookies have to give remain short odds so they don't get wiped out. So if you know how bookies work and you know how odds are set and you looked at those odds, you wouldn't necessarily say that the wisdom of crowds was saying remain was going to win. What you would say is that the bookies are giving remain short odds because they don't want to lose a lot of money. And then the other key point is that the betting pool generally was not a good reflection of the voting pool. There's self-selection going on. First of all, if you're going to go bet, you have to have money to lose. Not everybody has money to lose. Not everybody has £1,000 that they can throw on some bet, no matter how right they think they are. And so, but everybody can vote. Voting is free. The real wisdom of crowds experiments, where the classic experiment was, guess the weight of the cow at a county fair, or guess how many jelly beans in the jelly bean jar, at a county fair. And, the classic experiment was some expert would go up to the jelly bean jar and, get out a ruler and a calculator and calculate the diameter of the jar and the height of the jar and the cubic measure of the jar and the size of an average jelly bean, and take into account the curvature of the jelly bean in the open space, and do all that math and come up with a number. And generally speaking, that number would not be as good, not be as accurate as 1,000 people just saying, I think there's so many jelly beans in the jelly bean jar. That's the wisdom of crowds. And the way it works is that the extreme guesses filter out. So somebody says, I think there's 10 jelly beans in the jelly bean jar. Somebody else says, I think there's 1,000,000 jelly beans. Those two are the outliers. Those kind of cancel each other out on average. And the fact is the average number tends to be highly accurate. But there are a lot of differences between the jelly bean experiment I just described and the betting pool. Number one was the fact that there are no barriers to entry in the jelly bean. You can do it for free. You don't have to pay to do it, whereas in betting you do. And the other thing, and more important, is that the people actually stepping up to bet were, they were city bankers. They were people with a vested interest in the outcome. They were expressing their own biases. So there were a whole bunch of reasons why the betting odds were not a reflection of the actual vote or a reflection of the polls for that matter. But the market followed it, and that's where the opportunity was, because the minute I saw that the outcome was 50-50, but the odds were 80-20, that's the easiest trade in the world. I love those trades, because if you position for leave and you're wrong, you're not going to lose much because the market's already priced for remain. But if you bet leave and the market is priced for Remain, and Remain loses, you're going to make a fortune because the market has to suddenly reprice. It has to swing the other way. So it wasn't so much about putting a stake in the ground on Leave versus Remain as saying you want to do the Leave trade. The Leave trade was short sterling, long gold, because if it is Leave, the market has to reprice and you're going to make a ton of money. But if it's Remain, the market's already priced for Remain, you're not going to lose very much. You had this heads I win, tails you